Imagine the kitchen's morning heat, lard popping in a black pan, the same scent of salt and ash you have breathed for 5 months. Imagine a ledger on the table, its edges gummy with spilled syrup, pages turning like stiff leaves. Imagine the bell over the porch counting out chores, predictable as hunger, until the hidden rule breaks and breathing feels borrowed. This is the grim story of Isaiah Laurent, Louisiana, 1822. Imagine you were auctioned and branded, made to count other people's hours for years, and you finally felt a seam in the fence give under your hand. On the night the river fell and the cane fields crackled in a dry breath, the man they thought was just another body in the line lifted a kettle and made it fall like lava. He did not run first. He watched the flame take shape the way a plan becomes a path. He poured and stepped back, but when he turned to vanish into the dark rows, a child's lantern blinked from the cookhouse door and something utterly unexpected moved between them. Could the dogs be called off if the keys were not where they were supposed to be? Had the ledgers already recorded what no one living would admit? He poured the boiling sugar, and when he tried to run, the bell did not ring as usual. It rang wrong. Before we dive in, please subscribe if you follow work like this. Quiet, original investigations stitched from ledgers, ashes, and the ways wind writes the truth. The discovery was not made in a field, but in a room that smelled of old glue and mildew. On April 14, 2018, in New Orleans, a junior archivist opened a declassified packet from a parish court and slid a charred ledger onto felt. The book's spine had warped and buckled. The page that should have tallied rations for the week of a harvest feast carried instead a list of names with small crosses beside them and a smeared note, "Absence unexplained." Tucked inside was a single iron key fused to a ring of 3 others by a crust the color of burnt molasses and a scrap of linen printed with the outline of a fig leaf in sap. The image that stayed with the archivist, and with anyone who has touched this file since, was a stiff black stain in the margin that looked like a tide mark, as if a hot wave had once lapped the paper and receded. The estate at the edge of the river called itself St. Ruth. It was cane, mostly, with a small forge and a boiling house set downslope to the west where wind would push the smoke toward the cypress. The big house faced north, shutters deep green. A bell on the gallery hung from an iron yoke. The routines were iron too. The morning bell called bodies to the yard. The midday bell sent them to ration lines. The night bell, at last light, locked lives into small huts with doors that swelled in the swamp air. Surveillance was ordinary. An overseer's horse tracing the same loop, a clerk at a desk under a window, charting weather and yield, a pair of dogs staked near the boiling house, a neighbor who counted wagons that crossed the ferry and mentioned the count at supper. Isaiah Laurent moved in that system as if interlaced with it. He was purchased at auction in a river town in the late summer of 1817 and marched to St. Ruth with a group whose names the ledger recorded without kin. He said little that anyone remembered later, because he watched everything. He could read a draft in a hallway by the way a candle leaned. He could shoulder a cart and make it roll without groan. In the boiling house, he learned heat like other men learned scripture, the look of syrup at the edge before it throws a sheet, the sound of iron when strain runs through it. In the forge, he was ordinary with tongs and rasp. He kept, in the back of the hut where he slept, a ritual of small repairs, stitching rawhide, oiling hinges that no one had asked him to oil, counting nails into piles that meant something only to him. The wound he carried was not one event, but an accrual. A back that remembered an iron pressed twice, a face that held a pale scar below one eye, and a ledger entry that recorded the sale of a woman he had known only as Anais, without note of where she was sent. Antagonists at St. Ruth came dressed as family. The master, Silas Morrow, drank small and steady and liked his figures balanced more than his land clean. His vice was order, and he enforced it with fines written in a narrow hand against rations and rest. The mistress, Eliza Morrow, controlled the house with a neatness that cut, locks on pantries, bells on doors, a habit of counting spoons that made everyone into potential absence. The elder son, Nathaniel, wore authority as a coat, shorter than it needed to be and tight at the shoulders, and kept dogs near the sugar house as if a leash were a voice. The younger son, Cal, thin and clever, posted notices for bounties in the parish. He kept a second ledger under the primary, a book within a book, where he noted punishments as if they were debts that could be refinanced. The overseer, Mr. Pike, a neighbor's cousin, had a left boot heel shaved off to correct a twist in his gait. He carried a short rope in his pocket and a cheap watch in his vest that he believed ran true. The system breathed through artifacts. There was a decoy key ring that hung in the pantry where anyone could see it, while the real keys rode on a ring kept in the mistress's apron during the day and in a small locked box under her bed at night. There was a rusted lock on the old sugar bin that everyone ignored, and another lock on the brand that marked casks before shipment. There was a fig tree that pressed its leaves against the kitchen wall so fruit fell into the walkway where children could pretend not to notice. And there was the ledger, with columns marching across weeks, that recorded a disappearance as a subtraction rather than a life broken free or buried. A year after Isaiah arrived, bodies began to thin out of the line. First, a man named Jules did not answer at dawn. Then, a woman called Tilda did not take her ration. Then, 2 men who worked the mule line failed to return from the swamp trail where they were sent to cut poles for a fence. The overseer called these blanks insolence and posted riders. The ledger wrote them down as absences. In the quarters, people lowered eyes and muffled their small, necessary trades of thread and tobacco. The boiling house took on an extra dog. The bell, when it rang, felt louder. Isaiah's skills were not grand. They were small articulations of the physical world. He knew how to bank a fire so it looked asleep and then wake it with a twist of straw at the right mouth of air. He knew how to make a hinge sigh with the exact 2 drops of oil needed to remove the sound memory of a door. He knew, crucially, how the cane syrup behaved at each stage, and that if it left the pan at a sugar bridge, it would seal skin like a new surface of the world, and if it left at a lower stage, it would crawl into cloth and make it cling like grief. He cleaned the ladles to a brightness that made men joke he loved metal more than food. He did not love metal. He loved choice. The irreparable harm that turned choice into motive hardened on a day the ledger marked as unseasonably cool. Anais, who had laughed with her head tilted as if listening to something kind, did not come back from the wash. A page recorded her as hired out, and 3 mornings later the overseer returned a scrap of cloth that was not hers and a small comb missing 3 teeth. Isaiah watched the master sign a receipt for money not paid. He counted the strokes of the pen, the way the hand lifted, the small triumph in the clerk's eye at a sum he had aligned. Under the fig tree that evening, a child found a button and traded it for a length of blue thread. Isaiah took neither. He went to the boiling house and lifted the empty kettles one by one. The antagonists' weaknesses showed as clearly as their methods. Silas Morrow believed locks kept their own promises. Eliza believed keys could conquer hunger. Nathaniel believed dogs rendered thought unnecessary. Cal believed a secret ledger made him safe. Pike believed his watch's tick meant order beyond his flaw. Isaiah believed the world could be tilted if you found the hinge. Evidence seated itself without yet being recognized. The charred ledger page that would surface 2 centuries later took its stain on a night when a lamp broke and someone patched the guttering flame with a spoon of syrup that went too far and lipped over. The decoy keyring rusted in an old streak that exactly matched the hook mark on the pantry jamb. The rope in Pike's pocket wore a polished nub where a knot had been taut and untaught until it moved by reflex. The fig tree, which was not native to the place, had been planted by a woman who had once kept bees. It drew wasps to the kitchen door that every child learned to wave aside with a palm fan. And beneath the boiling house floor, where scrap metal and broken tools were kicked, a small wedge of iron lay so long that its dull edge became a kind of language. Force spread, not focused. St. Ruth turned toward harvest with the air turned brittle. Nights went sharp early. The river ran low enough that the ferry scraped. The overseer shifted guard rotations, which mostly meant he shifted the hours when he drank. Eliza added a new lock to the pantry and placed the key next to her bed on a small plate, a habit that meant she could hear it ring if it moved. Cal began to take the second ledger to bed with him, as if numbers could warm. Nathaniel moved the dogs closer to the kettles and set a small boy to watch the chain stakes by day. The bell rope frayed under a cup hook. Isaiah measured heat, wind, and habit. He noticed the draft that pulled through the boiling house when the north door and the east window were both cracked a thumb's width. He noticed that the dogs fell quiet when the kettles reached a certain hiss, maybe soothed by the constant note. He noticed that on Sundays the mistress counted spoons and then, tired, put the key plate on the wrong side of the bed. He noticed that the ferryman who shared tobacco with Pike had a cough that made him stop at the halfway oak to spit every time, which meant anyone stepping to the riverbank could cross the open stretch unseen if they timed it to the echo of that cough. He noticed that the fig tree, which dropped its fruit just after dusk, drew children and, once, a child with a lantern. The ticking signal began as a date on a calendar tacked by the clerk's window. A harvest feast, the third Sunday after the first front. It sharpened into the sound of fabric torn from a bolt for table runners. It tightened with the smell of tallow as candles were poured. It came down to a rope, dry and ready to part if pulled wrong, and a bell that would not ring the way it always had. By late afternoon of the chosen day, clouds stacked above the cypress but did not break. Wind ran flat across the cane. In the boiling house, the first kettle of syrup rose to the lip and then settled back. The ledger lay open to a clean page. The decoy key ring hung where anyone could see it, harmless as a lie. The real keys were on a plate. The child with the lantern had been sent to shoe wasps from the kitchen door, and Isaiah, hands steady from a lifetime of other people's orders, set the ladle down and waited for the bell. The plan did not announce itself as vengeance. It arrived as physics and patience, as a line drawn through air and habit. Isaiah Laurent mapped Saint Ruth by sensation, which doors fought their jams, which floorboards carried a hollow note, which paths through cane held firm even after rain. He traced 4 currents he could ride on one night if weather held: heat, wind, keys, and time. Heat lived in the boiling house. That room, low and wide, wore soot the way a black coat holds light. Drafts crossed it in a thin X when the north door stood a hand's width and the east window opened 2 fingers' breadth. Wind on most evenings jogged out of the north and pulled smoke across the yard to the cypress. Keys belonged to the mistress by day, but to sleep by night. He had seen the plate placed on the wrong side of the bed when candles burned down after long counting. Time belonged to the bell, and the bell rope had frayed. He needed the bell to sound wrong. He needed ears to look up at sound instead of watching hands at work. Set piece 1 began with wasps. A fig dropped at dusk, as always, and the kitchen door swarmed in a soft haze of wings. The child with the lantern had been taught to shoo them in loops that kept stings away from wrists. Isaiah leaned from the shadow of the pantry and sent a palm fan across the doorway at the exact second the lantern arced. Light turned to bright cloth for a blink. With the decoy keys glinting on the wall hook, any eye would read safety. His hand slid beneath the apron hung on a peg and came away with nothing. The real keys were not there. He shifted, slow as starch, to the corner where a wicker hamper sat, and under it, a small lockbox scuffed by shoes that had kicked it aside a dozen careless nights. The top had no lock engaged. Her habit had slipped. He palmed the ring, 3 iron keys and a small brass one, and then made the decoy clink against the hook as if a careless elbow had knocked it. The child turned at the sound, the lantern lifted, and eyes widened. The unexpected moved between them, not fear, not accusation, but a slow recognition that this was a hinge and someone had turned it. The child lowered the lantern and used the palm fan again, as if nothing had changed. That grace did not fit Isaiah's plan. It expanded it. He set the keys into his waistband and left a twin weight in the lockbox, a ring of scrap hoops he had shaped to the same heft. The procedural flaw showed itself late. As he backed into the pantry's dusk, his heel touched a spoon dropped near the fig basket. It chimed on the tiles with a bright, thin note. In the still of pre-feast, Eliza Morrow lifted her head. She crossed the threshold in 3 steps, counted spoons with the speed of prayer, and slid her hand into the lockbox. She found metal there and let the lid fall. Keys at night were a ritual as much as protection. She believed the ritual had held. Isaiah's plan for the moment still stood. Set piece 2 occupied the boiling house. He had stoked the fire hours early under pretense of reducing a stubborn batch. Syrup moved from straw to thread to soft ball. He coaxed the hiss until it sang at the note that quieted the dogs. Nathaniel Morrow, drunk on heat more than drink, came to check the level and sniffed satisfaction, the way men pretend that labor is their own when all they have done is look at it. Isaiah had placed a shallow pan near the lip where overflow would slide if jarred. He switched the ladle with a longer-handled one he had filed thinner along the neck. He needed it to bend at the exact second a human wrist would trust it. He needed a cascade that looked like accident. Silas Morrow arrived on the gallery above the kettles with a clerk behind him, wanting to see the shine he could sell. Isaiah stepped to the side and hooked the north door back to its notch. The draft pulled. The syrup rose clean. He registered the position of each body, master above, elder son near the dogs, overseer at the threshold tapping the heel of his shaved boot, clerk with pencil lifted, child with lantern far off beyond the kitchen, light like a star by the fig leaves. Isaiah lifted the long ladle, gave it weight with a scoop, and extended it toward the pan's center as if to steady a swell. He pressed the filed neck against the pan rim. Metal, tired. It bent with a soft give that sounded like breath leaving a job. The load slid, an amber sheet that tipped and carried its own weight forward. It went not toward Isaiah, but toward the gallery above where Silas had leaned without understanding drafts. The wave left the ladle, found the edge, and leapt. What looked like lava did not flame. It seized. It struck and clung, sealing skin, turning motion into sculpture. Isaiah did not watch long. He let the ladle fall, stepped backward through steam, and palmed the iron wedge from beneath the workbench. Nathaniel's dog surged at the change in pitch, chains scraping. Pike lunged for the bell rope, missed, and swore that it had shortened. He did not know Isaiah had cut away 2 turns and retied them lower. The bell rang, but wrong. A breath late and choked, a note that made heads tilt without feet running. Confusion granted seconds. Isaiah used everyone. Set piece 3 lived in paper. Cal Morrow kept his second ledger under the primary, a thin deceit that flattered itself. Earlier that day, Isaiah had slipped a folded scrap under the desk foot, so the desk listed a hair toward the window. Only a body sitting carelessly would notice. Now, with screams silenced into shock, Cal ran from the yard toward the office to fetch order. He slammed the desk with his hip, and the ledgers slid into his hands. The primary opened to the clean page for the feast week. The second flipped to a leaf Isaiah had prepped with a thread and pin. The thread tugged loose and a small packet fell, a twist of linen from Anaïs's comb pouch that Isaiah had kept. Cal stooped to retrieve it, and when his head went down, the office door whispered shut on its oiled hinges. Isaiah, already inside, used the brass key from Eliza's ring on the brand lock that held the cask stamp. He was not there to stamp. He needed the iron lever in the lock's throat. The lever came away with a twist. The lock lost its will. He slid the lever behind the desk like a long nail and stepped back through the linen closet, a narrow service passage that only someone who cleaned it would know. When Cal rose, he was alone with 2 books and a memory he could not place. Set piece 4 moved in the yard with dogs and chain stakes. Isaiah carried the iron wedge like a thought he had repeated until it no longer felt like decision. The chain stakes had been driven into earth that packed hard in dry spells and softened at dusk. He had soaked the leftmost stake with a slow leak from a dropped bucket 2 days running, then tamped dirt to hide the color change. When Nathaniel yanked at the leashes to pull the dogs across the kettles for control, the softened stake tore free. The dogs bolted, not toward Isaiah but toward motion, Pike stumbling and Cal shouting from the office path. Chains tangled around ankles, flesh met ground. The yard became a knot of metal and men. Isaiah used that mess as cover to reach the gallery stairs. The countermove came loud. A neighbor's rider, drawn by the wrong bell, pounded through the gate. The sight of the master on the gallery, rigid with a mask of sugar, turned the rider from help to alarm. He wheeled his horse and blew a whistle meant for river thieves. 2 farmhands on the ferry bank heard it and started toward St. Ruth at a trot. The night had shifted from Isaiah's private geometry to a public cry. He adapted by speeding what he had planned to stretch. He ran the gallery's length and used Eliza's keyring as if it were his hand. The pantry lock gave. He turned the key in the small chest under the bed without forcing it, as if he had an eternity to respect tin. He took the pistol she kept and slid it into the cook's bin of flour. Not to fire it, to deny it. His aim was silence married to heat. He swept the table runner's end through a pan of tallow and laid that strip across the threshold between dining room and hall where drafts met. He struck flint against the iron of the brand lever, that was why he had stolen it, and coaxed a slow, crawling flame that knew cloth before it knew wood. Fire in Cane Country is a law written long before men. It takes time to lift its head, but then it moves. He crossed to the children's room where shutters stuck. He worked the hinge with oil he had pocketed weeks before. He lifted 2 small bodies and put them on the garden path, one by one, in shadow where the fig leaves met the kitchen wall. He did not look back to see if the child with the lantern understood. He only felt the absence of weight and added that absence to his count. He met Eliza in the hall as smoke learned the corners. She reached for a key that was not where a ritual promised it would be. Her hand struck the plate and heard metal, but the rings were false. By the time her mind turned to the chest, Isaiah had passed her, august with intention, and slid the brand lever through the gallery latch so the door would not open outward. He needed air to pull fire inward. He stepped into the yard and felt the flame take the hall in a long exhale. He still owed the planned 2 acts, the office and the swamp trail. The office he approached sideways, skirting a wash line to avoid the boot prints the clerk would later map in his mind. He reached through the linen closet slit and palmed the second ledger. He did not tear it. He opened its middle to the page where punishments had been tallied like debts and lifted a coal with the tongs he had carried under his shirt. He touched that coal to the margin to score a dark oval that would never read as accident. He then placed the coal on the sill, where soot would print the clerk's careful fingertips when he sought to prove blame. He left behind not a signature, but a sentence. Paper tells truth at the speed of ash. The swamp trail was a mouth of dark at the yard's far edge. He had staged a hoard of dried bagasse near the storehouse door 2 days earlier, and now kicked it with his heel so it scattered like chaff along the fence. A lamp, tipped, found that path and glowed, making a false river for any rider to chase. He sent 2 elders and 3 children along that bright trick toward the ferry, to stall pursuit at the water with pleas that would be believed and name no names. He turned himself instead toward the cypress, where the old fence posts rotted to stools that did not show prints. At the barracks, he paused for one last hinge. He lifted the latch on the store bin with the rusted lock that no one used. Into that bin, he dropped the brass key from Eliza's ring and the iron lever from the brand lock. He closed the hasp so loosely that a night breeze could worry it open. Any searcher at dawn would find what mattered in the wrong place and draw the wrong map first. Delay was escape's kin. The misstep that nearly ruined him came small and exact. On the path past the washtub, his foot landed on a sliver of iron from the broken ladle neck. It bit skin. He bled a fine line that a careful man could track. He tore a strip from his shirt and wound it, then stepped into the shallow ditch where washwater ran. He let the water take the red. He walked in the ditch until it met the cane rows, then stepped out on dry soil with clean soles. That lesson would sit in a sheriff's report like an instruction for ghosts. Fire in the big house found the stairwell and took it as a ladder. Men in the yard could not reach the gallery door for the lever jammed through the latch. Nathaniel, tangled once, freed himself and swung a hook at the lever with rage for craft he did not understand. Cal, coughing, dragged the clerk to the well. Pike, left boot scrabbling, tried the bell again and again, each ring wrong, each ring late. Eliza stood at the parlor threshold counting keys that were not keys, and then counting breaths that would not answer her count. Silas Morrow did not descend the stairs. Syrup had sealed his face, and then smoke sealed the room. Isaiah did not climb to see what mercy could or could not be found. He had poured the world he had studied onto the man who had owned him on paper. He had moved children like pages from a ledger to a safe column. He had set a line of tallow to teach wind the direction of justice. He had taken tools and given back errors that would bloom into evidence. The irreversible moment arrived without flourish. The boiling house, its rafters sweat wet, caught a tongue of fire carried by draft from the hall. Flames stepped across air the way a dancer takes a measured span and then does not stop. From that point, St. Ruth would never again be what it had called itself. The bell, choked, gave one final wrong note and then a thud as the rope parted at the cup hook. Dogs dragged chains toward the river, wild with noise. The neighbor's rider blew his whistle until breath failed, and Isaiah, holding nothing but the wedge wrapped in cloth and a small comb with 3 missing teeth, crossed into the cane and did not look back. Behind him, paper browned, keys cooled, and the fig tree shook its leaves in the new heat. In front of him, the swamp trail took his steps like a keeper of secrets and erased them one by one. The morning after the fire, St. Ruth Plantation stood as a geometry of ash and angles. Rafters jutted like broken ribs, the gallery sagged, and the bell hung sideways, rope severed. The air carried the acrid tang of cane smoke layered with tallow. Discovery began not with law, but with neighbors who had smelled the night and seen flame against the sky. By first light, wagons rolled in, their wheels scoring mud that still held the memory of Isaiah's ditchwater steps. The first evidence gathered was visual. Silas Morrow's body, frozen in a blackened chair on the gallery, face sealed in sugar glass, arms fixed in a pose of grasping that would never close. The overseer Pike lay half buried under chain links, left boot twisted away, rope still in his hand. The bell's rope ended in a rough cut 2 spans above reach, its ends frayed in a way no natural break would produce. The clerk, half conscious, pointed to the ledger retrieved from the office sill, edges browned, margin blistered. His fingers bore soot that told its own story. Coal lifted, not fallen, placed with intent. Institutional response moved quickly. On the 17th of October, 1822, a sheriff from the parish court assembled a jury of inspection under the shade of the cypress. They recorded distances with rough tape, from gallery to yard, from boiling house door to the knot of dogs still tethered, from pantry lock to the charred remains of the dining room. The sheriff wrote in his notes that the locks had been tampered by hand, unpracticed yet precise. A brass key found in the disused bin confirmed it. Eliza Morrow's second set of keys had been displaced from ritual, swapped for iron scrap. The evidence of misdirection became plain. What belonged in bedchamber lay in storehouse, what belonged on gallery lay in yard. Testimonies from the quarters were muted. No one spoke Isaiah Laurent's name aloud, but every ledger pointed backward to his arrival in 1817. A pattern emerged. Jules absent, Tilda absent, Muleman absent, each disappearance marked on the same pages where Isaiah's rations remained steady. It became impossible for the sheriff to ignore the alignment of loss. Oral fragments leaked. A man who oiled hinges no one asked him to oil, who studied fire the way other men studied scripture, who kept a comb with 3 missing teeth. The militia came on the 19th. They searched the swamp trail, finding prints that began clean and then vanished into ditchwater. A scrap of cloth marked with blood was retrieved near the wash path, wrapped around a shard of bent iron. The sheriff described it as evidence of self-wound treated by cunning. No dogs could trace beyond the cypress line. Riders circled marshland for 3 days and returned with nothing but mosquitoes in their ears. In court proceedings later that year, testimony hardened into euphemism. The phrase, absence unexplained, shifted into flight of dangerous person. The deaths of the Morrow family were recorded not as murders, but as casualties of fire during disorder. Isaiah's name appeared only once in a sealed appendix tagged as property unredeemed. The verdict of the inspection jury closed the ledger on St. Ruth. Cause, conflagration, origin, unknown, result, total. The outcome lived in rumor, not paper. Some said Isaiah fled downriver, hiding in ferry boats and finding cover among free men in New Orleans. Others whispered he crossed the Cypress into maroon camps that grew like hidden villages, unlisted on any map. A few claimed he turned predator still, a shadow that haunted plantations one by one, striking where ledgers showed gaps. None could prove the echo, yet all repeated it. The plantation class changed its habits because of it. Locks multiplied, pantries grew heavier doors, keys were tied not to plates by bedsides, but to chains around wrists. Ledger clerks doubled their entries and kept copies in parish vaults. Overseers walked their loops with sharper dogs, and bells were inspected each week for wear. Fear entered the system not as accident, but as a new rule, vigilance, constant and brittle. For descendants, the legacy shifted in other ways. Oral memory carried Isaiah not as criminal, but as warning and proof. A man mistaken for ordinary, bought at auction, had turned a state order into a state ruin. Songs murmured at night spoke of a ladle bent, a bell that rang wrong, and a fig tree that dropped fruit onto the path where children waited with lanterns. In 2018, when the archivist touched the charred ledger, that symbol returned. The fig leaf pressed in sap against linen seemed unchanged across centuries, a print of life in the margins of ruin. Once it had shaded children from wasps while Isaiah slid keys into his palm. Now it lived in a box, stiff and permanent, bearing witness that order can be rewritten when one man refuses its column. The story of Saint Ruth closed not with fire alone, but with silence. No body of Isaiah Laurent was ever found, no grave marked. What endured were the tools and the paper, a cut rope, a scorched margin, a brass key out of place. They spoke in his stead. They carried the verdict he had chosen, that a man counted as nothing could balance an entire ledger by flame and vanish into swamp air. And in the parish where bells still ring, the memory of one